Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 32nd episode of the Exploring Antinatalism Podcast, a podcast all about the subject of antinatalism created by anti-natalists. My name is Amanda Oldfan Sukenick, also known as Forever Wolf Films on YouTube.
And I'm Mark J. Maharaj, also known as Question Mark on YouTube. And today we're speaking with author, scholar, and freelance writer Phil Torres. He is author of A Crisis of Faith, Atheism, Emerging Technologies, and the Future of Humanity, The End, What Science and Religion Tell Us About the Apocalypse, Morality, Foresight, and Human Flourishing, an Introduction to Existential Risks, and the forthcoming book, Human Extinction, A History of Thinking About the End of the World. Welcome, Phil. Thanks so much for being our guest today on the Exploring Antinatalism podcast.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Great to have you. Before we begin, I just wanted to say that if you wish to learn more about Phil Torres, make sure to head over to Mark's channel, Question Mark, for another interview that they did a few months back. It's great stuff. So, Phil, let me just start out by asking you some basic questions about yourself. In your words, who is Phil Torres?
Well, I'm a scholar, author, freelance writer. I think you had mentioned that. For the past decade or so, I've been working on mostly global catastrophic and existential risks, to humanity and to human civilization. As you mentioned, I've written a bunch of books, and I've tried to not only do some hopefully original research on the topic, but also to be a sort of ambassador for the subject by writing articles for popular media as well. My research right now actually focuses on policy aspects and ethical implications of geoengineering. But for the past year and a half or so, I've been working on this book, which is an intellectual history of our modern scientific naturalistic notion of human extinction. All the way, going back to antiquity, all the way through the Cold War and up to, contemporary existential risk studies.
Okay, excellent. Thank you for that. Phil, are you an antinatalist? And if so, why? And if not, why not?
So I am this. I think this is the case with a lot of philosophical issues, particularly a lot of ethical questions. More than anything, I'm confused. I feel like the more I've researched these topics, the more a sort of uninformed perplexity has been replaced with just informed perplexity. So I feel the strength of a lot of the arguments for antinatalism. For example, Benatar's asymmetry argument. It seems cogent to me, and so consequently, I do. I have an inclination to agree with his conclusion that there's something morally problematic about procreation. At the same time, I also feel pulled by these arguments that human extinction would be a great tragedy. And so, the reason I talked to Mark a couple of months ago was because I had published this paper where I'm trying to reconcile these two divergent and in-tension tendencies in my thinking. So I don't have children. I have no plan to have children. But some of that is because of the philosophical considerations. Other reasons have to do with just contingent facts about our world. Like I can't guarantee that, given climate change and biodiversity loss and the sixth mass extinction event and so on, that a child born today is going to have a good adventure on this little twirling orb. So I'm a bit. I don't know if I'd call myself an anti-natalist, but I'm certainly, find myself wandering around that neighborhood, you might say.
No, I think that's fair. You're sympathetic to antinatalism.
I am.
But you believe human extinction would be the greatest ultimate tragedy, and you're writing the tension of those opposites. Which is
yes. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. That makes sense. When was the first time you heard the word antinatalism, and what led you to wish to write about it?
That's a really good question. I can't recall when exactly I came across it. It probably, so, Benatar's book was, I think, 2006. And I believe it was probably about 10 years ago that I first came across the term, and then a sort of systematic, I think in Benatar's work, a systematic philosophical account of why procreation might be, morally wrong. But frankly, I know it's not that uncommon for younger people to reflect on the ethics of having children. I remember having conversations when I was much younger with people about how is it fair that none of us has to be born, and yet there was this existential decision that was made for us without proper consultation, without consent, so even going back to 20 years ago, I felt a bit sympathetic with this view that perhaps there's something problematic about having children. But yeah, so probably a decade ago, and immediately sort of found Benatar's work to be forceful and to be quite powerful. So yeah, I feel like the issue is becoming more and more germane, given the fact that, as I mentioned before, the climate crisis, the environmental crisis more generally, is just worsening, by the year. And I suspect that there are people, like there's the birth strike movements that I think originated in the UK. So essentially, it was people, as I understand it, who were discovering the anti-natalist philosophy just independently based on an empirical assessment of our existential predicament today. So
Right.
So I feel like its growing relevance is another reason I'm pulled towards writing about it and taking this idea seriously.
What led you to, I know you get asked this a lot, but what led you down the path of extinction studies, or it's like a type of secular eschatology? How did you get into this whole field, and what's driving you there?
Yeah, I think so biographically, the seeds of interest in the sort of a longer term future of humanity, I feel like were planted when I was quite young, because I grew up in a very religious community, and the sort of theological orientation of the community was dispensationalist, generally speaking. So this is a framework for interpreting scripture that essentially was invented in the 19th century by a guy named John Nelson Darby, Irish guy, as I remember. And part of there's the framework is both sort of backwards looking historical, but also forward looking eschatological. And part of the framework is the notion of the rapture, and rapture is going to happen, and then there's the tribulation, and then the second coming and the millennial kingdom, and that's the basic chronology. Anyways, the point is that there was lots of talk of the rapture, of the second coming, when I was growing up, and I've mentioned this in a number of podcasts or interviews, but I have a sort of vivid memory of when Bill Clinton was first elected, and being overcome, being just imbued with a kind of trepidation, a kind of fear, because his name was so closely associated with the Antichrist. And so I've along with many people in the community, at least especially my mom and the people she associated with, this I sort of interpreted this as the beginning of the eschaton, the end of the world. So anyways, I was really interested in the destiny of humanity from an early age. And then, once I apostatized my Christian beliefs, there was just this void. Then, there wasn't a story, a narrative in account of what the future holds for humanity. And it's probably around that time or shortly after that I discovered the work of like Nick Bostrom, who in 2002 had formalized this notion of an existential risk, which is basically any event that would prevent us from realizing our full potential. So that includes like human extinction. And so there was the question of what might lie ahead, dot the roads ahead for humanity. That the scientific approach was very interesting, very appealing, very intriguing to me, and so yeah, and also this topic has been extraordinarily neglected.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Speaking of neglected fields, does the philosophy of death, does that incorporate into your studies as well with existential risk? Because that area tends to be not that popular as well.
Yeah, not all that much. I mean, some things that come to mind immediately are like in terms of assessing the badness of certain human extinction scenarios.
Yeah, I think like Samuel Scheffler may have talked about this. But usually it's like, what is the time that death would be bad, and why would it be bad, and can there be post-harmonious harm to people who are dead, and what does that mean time-wise for people before they come into existence? So there's a lot, but I feel like on a global scale, if I say something like not coming into existence is a harm, or that being put out of existence is also a harm, like that sort of trickles into the existential risk stuff too.
Yeah, I think it does. So for example, there are extinction scenarios that could very well be instantaneous. So like one possibility that people have talked about is like, the nucleation of a vacuum bubble. So, if the universe is in this false vacuum state, you could sort of tip it into a true vacuum state, which would create this bubble expanding in all directions at the speed of light, and it would just destroy everything in its path. So, point is, that's a scenario that at least it's theoretically possible that high-powered particle accelerator could nucleate one of these vacuum bubbles. The probability seems very low, but then again, if one had happened, in our past light cone, we might not be here to talk about it. So, so the observation selection effect might actually affect our probability assessments of this scenario. So the point is that there'd be no physical or psychological suffering if in this scenario, but you still might say that death, according to Benatar, who holds an anti-Epicurean view of the badness of death, death could still be bad for the one who dies, because it would deprive us of future potential goods, and so I'm trying to connect the philosophy of death with extinction. There is some overlap.
Okay, yeah. So that was just like what I was trying to understand, is that if you're like not just familiar with the material, but if you incorporate that contemporary deprivationist account into your work. And also, and this is my last question before, because I really would like Amanda and you to talk about extinction. Do you take a sentiocentric view of ethics, where like other non-human sentient animals would be moral patients, and they would be under deliberation, and are they incorporated in this worldview about extinction, or is it just human centric?
No, definitely. My circle of moral concern is quite broad. Definitely includes any sentient creature, including perhaps machines if they're sentient at some point in the future. I don't really have a worked out view. I mean, maybe this ties back to what I was saying initially, that I feel increasingly my confusion is just becomes more and more informed over time as I study these issues, but the confusion is still there. So in terms of like which ethical theory I prefer, or what sort of robustly theoretical account I could give of why it is that all sentient creatures have the moral patient kind of status. I don't really have I couldn't explain that exactly, but my intuitions are very strong about this, that absolutely anything that can feel pain needs to be included in our moral decision making.
Thank you. Amanda, you want to go?
Yes, absolutely. Okay, well, thank you for that. So now I think we'd love to both ask you about your article, Can Anti-Natalists Oppose Human Extinction, which was released the 19th of August, 2020 in the South African Journal of Philosophy. You talked a little bit about this already, but can I start out by asking you a little bit about what led you to write this specific piece?
Yeah, so it really, it is the fact that on the one hand, the anti-natalist arguments, particularly from Benatar, but I actually mentioned in the article that there are other deontological arguments that are pretty compelling as well. So there's a multifaceted argumentative apparatus that supports the anti-natalist view, and again, there's a kind of cogency to that perspective that is appealing to me. But on the other hand, I've been thinking about human extinction and the ethical implications of that, and all that would be lost if human civilization were to disappear forever. It would be the termination of all the multi-generational projects like scientific discovery, artistic development, and so on and so on, moral progress as well. And so in all of, I feel convinced that tentatively convinced, I would say, that there is something monumentally bad about a scenario in which the human population drops to zero and stays that way forever. But nonetheless, I'm somewhat of a Benatarian, so. I feel like this actually is something I've come across with respect to the work of a number of different philosophers in the past, like Colin McGinn. He published a book, I think it was 1993, and I think it was called Problems in Philosophy, where he talks about essentially that his claim is that a lot of the perennial questions in philosophy are permanently and in principle unanswerable by human beings, given certain limitations that inhere in our mental machinery. We just simply cannot generate the concepts needed to answer these questions. And so reading that book, it struck me that never once does he consider the possibility of a technological solution to this problem. Namely, maybe we should go and augment our cognitive system. Maybe we should re-engineer our mental machinery to augment the library of concepts that we have available to us. And consequently, then these insoluble philosophical puzzles could very well then become soluble. So the point of that is kind of a similar thing reading Benatar, where he doesn't seem to consider the possibility that there are certain emerging technologies which could change the human condition in a way that undercuts his claim that if you're an anti-natalist, therefore you must be pro-extinction, because we have these limited lifespans, and that's taken for granted in his argument. Therefore, if we all stop procreating, just as a result of senescence, the human population will eventually disappear. But that may not be the case. I mean, there is it seems, this is just a descriptive hypothesis, but it seems very plausible to me that over the next century there will be biomedical advances that enable us to prolong the human lifespan, far beyond the natural limits, and perhaps even indefinitely. So if that's possible, then that's a potential workaround such that you can accept the anti-natalist premises, but then avoid this pro-extinction, or this conclusion that extinction necessarily follows from a universal refusal to have children. So that, yeah, so that's the thrust of the argument. And then, I look at various implications of that, such as like one way to achieve a kind of functional immortality is through mind uploading. But there are good arguments made that certain forms of mind uploading will result in a different person than the individual who began. So from an anti-natalist perspective, if you think that bringing into existence a new person is wrong, and also if you think that death is bad, which Benatar does because he holds that anti-Epicurean view, then mind uploading is doubly bad because it results in the death of an individual and the creation of a new person. So there's just kind of interesting implications. Happy to talk about that. I hope I didn't launch into that too quicker, haphazardly, but.
No. That was excellent. That was excellent. I definitely want to speak more to you about the life extension in a little while. And yeah, I was very intrigued by the discussion of mind uploading in your discussion with Mark in that previous interview. And yeah, I do think that is basically a new form, a future form of procreation in a sense. So it's very frightening to me, I have to say. But I figured the best way to further explore your paper would be to go through all the ways I agree and disagree with you about, if and when an antinatalist can oppose human extinction. So I think a lot of these are less questions than perhaps just point of further discussion. If we're lucky, we'll see where we get. So let me preface this by saying that I am a pro-extinctionist antinatalist. I am what's called an ethylist or a sentiocentric anti-natalist, which means that I think all life should go extinct. I would unplug the material universe if that were to be possible. I personally don't think that there are good reasons why anti-natalists should oppose extinction, but the truth is that there are those that do. It is just a fact of anti-natalism. The anti-natalist spectrum has many colors in it, and we can't agree on anything except that procreation is bad most of the time. So the first way that I think anti-natalists sometimes do oppose human extinction is just if you view sort of the history of anti-natalism, you will see that sort of pre-Benatar, pre-vehement voluntary human extinction movement, if we were to include that in this discussion, pre-Koenig, who was sort of an obscure German antinatalist philosopher in the early 1800s, late 1800s, early 1900s. Anti-natalism, such as it existed back then, again, without this word attached to it, that didn't happen until much later, it wasn't particularly focused on extinction at all. It more had to do with a type of anti-natalistic thinking, a lamentation of one's birth, perhaps a critique against humanity, but it never really got there in any kind of to a discussion of extinction. Now, I have to preface again by saying that I am contrary to popular belief, I am not an anti-natalist historian. So there may be little instances here and there that I'm just not thinking of or don't know of, where extinction was more sort of on the table. But I would say that I hope I'm not a no extinction anti-natalism is actually sort of more of a description of the anti-natalism as it existed prior to, say, 2006, let's just say for safety's sake. So I was wondering sort of what you think about that it's more of an older form of anti-natalism that you're kind of calling back to with this paper in that sense.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So my suspicion is that the earlier so I mean, there's questions about whether or not like Arthur Schopenhauer was an anti-natalist. Like he his focus primarily was on, how to respond to the predicament, the plight that we all find ourselves in, and less about how to prevent it. So he didn't say all that much about. There is a single line from his essay, which I think was like 1882. I want to say. On the sufferings of the world, something close to that. Maybe correct me if you remember that. On the sufferings of the world.
I think you're correct.
And basically he says, if it were the case that individuals were fully rational and they understood just how much suffering life entails, then surely the human species would go extinct. I think that's the only thing he actually mentions. And then there's Edward von Hartmann, who was a little bit younger and was part of the 18 it was basically the end of the 19th century and part of the so-called pessimism controversy in Germany. And he had a really fascinating take on this, where he basically combined Schopenhauerian philosophical pessimism with a kind of like Hegelian theory of history. So, basically the idea was that over time, we're developing our consciousness, and we're going through various stages, and eventually we will come to the realization that the only solution to life's the suffering and the violence and the misery of existence is the complete destruction of even the very possibility of life in the universe. So he actually really rejected Schopenhauer's view as like, that it's a band-aid. It's not a solution to the problem. The solution to the problem is the annihilation of all life in the universe. So obviously that touches on the issue of extinction, but and not to be long-winded about this, apologies if I am being that.
Not at all, not at all.
Yeah, but I suspect that the reason extinction wasn't talked about so much was simply just wasn't on really anybody's radar. It was the second half of the 19th century, for the first time, really following the discovery of the second law of thermodynamics. That was kind of the first time, a trigger that inspired, galvanized people to take seriously the possibility of extinction. But that was a very temporally distant event. The Earth cooling down as a result of the second law and entropy, and life eventually being extinguished. So, if nuclear weapons had been invented in the middle of the 18th century, extinction might very much have been on a topic of discussion by anti-natalists. So so the point of that is to say that I'm not sure they really took a position on it. It just wasn't something that anyone really thought that much about. And also my understanding of Vehement is, I guess that was founded, Les Unite wouldn't say founded, but he sort of brought together that community in the early 1990s, I think. And my understanding is, they are explicit about, well, it's in the name. They do want humanity to eventually go extinct. So it wasn't. So am I wrong in thinking it wasn't just there wasn't just a different version of anti-natalism before 2006? Does that make sense?
So anti-natal. Sorry, I didn't interrupt you at all. But no, I think in speaking to a lot of what you just said, anti-natalism has been sort of amorphous for a long time. So yes, so certainly Vehement predates David Benatar, predates 2006, but it didn't use the word anti-natalism. So it's the same but a little bit different. It was a precursor, and it's very different than it's all anti-procreation. It's all under the same umbrella. But what separates it sort of from the features of modern antinatalism or Benatarian antinatalism is that it has a completely different attitude towards the animals. So Vehement wishes the animals to inherit the earth, and sentiocentric antinatalism, or whatever we wish to call it at the minute, wishes to include animals within the antinatalist consideration. But I agree with you. I think in one of the papers, in one of the papers that you said, and I do plan to speak with you a little bit about this a bit later, but you, in one of the articles, and I apologize, I don't remember the exact name of it, you do make that point that it was really not before 1945, right, that, human extinction could be this actually conceivable, attainable, if that's the word we want to attach to it, kind of thing. So I agree with you there that it does make sense why historical antinatalism was kind of not quite there yet, because the possibilities of human extinction outside of apocalyptic religion seemed impossible, if if I'm correct in assessing your point. Yeah.
Yeah, totally right. I mean, so this, the history here touches on the stuff I've been writing about in the intellectual history book, it's very. The story of antinatalism and the connection with extinction really is bound up in all sorts of interesting ways with the narrative, historical narrative of how we, a narrative that includes, discovery of the second law, the invention of nuclear weapons, and there were all sorts of people who, prior to 1945, who did speculate about various kill mechanisms that had the capacity to eliminate every single human on the planet, but they were all just idiosyncratic speculations. Jules Verne in late 19th century book, the balloon is in the title. I'm just blanking on the name right now. But anyway, so one of the characters there talks about the possibility of a giant boiler exploding and destroying the planet. And there are various other examples of anthropogenic kill mechanisms. But really, it was I would date it to the mid 1950s, following the Castle Bravo test. That was really the watershed moment, the game changer. There was a lot of apocalyptic rhetoric following the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but there wasn't a widely accepted mechanism by which a nuclear conflict could actually decimate the entirety of humanity until the Castle Bravo test, which it was an explosion that was 2.5 times bigger than they expected, and it spread radioactive particles all the way around the planet. So then people were like, okay, now we know even a small scale, thermonuclear conflict. Yeah. So it is really, it's interesting that's it's interesting to think about, antinatalists, what they might have said about extinction had that just been more foregrounded in their thinking about the space of future logical possibility.
Well, the next example I want to speak to is speaking a little bit more towards antinatalist history, but focusing on one specific type. This is, again, less a reason why I think antinatalists can oppose human extinction, but just an acknowledgement of one of the ways that it sometimes does, and that would be religious-based antinatalism. Now, again, I in no way profess to be an expert in religious antinatalism, but it is out there in various forms, and it does have a very long history. While it's quite obvious that often religion does obsess about apocalypse, and so by proxy, human extinction is in there somewhere. I don't see any evidence from the religious antinatalists that I've known, and there is one book called Christian Antinatalism by a guy named Martin Smith, called No Baby, No Cry, and that I see no evidence that they are at all interested in destroying God's creation. I don't see any evidence that they are actually extinctionist minded in any kind of way. It may have to do more of not wanting kids. I mean, not so much just relegated to the world of child free. There's certainly, but it's something a bit different than that.
I'm not that conversant with religious antinatalism. One thing that does come to mind immediately. So I'd be curious to know if the author you just mentioned brings this up, but there are some of the Pauline epistles where the Apostle Paul, who was an apocalypticist, so he expected the at least this seems to be the case, seemed to have expected the end of the world within his lifetime, and he does exhort his readers not to get married. I think he explicitly says not to have children, although I would double check that. But yeah, I mean that's a very interesting syncretism of ideas. So I would like to know more about that at some point, but I'm not an expert.
That's all right. There's some very anti-natalistic even passages from the Bible, and apparently Kierkegaard was quite anti-natalistic, and also there's the Cathars. There's quite a lot. I mean, I'm no expert in this, but it's definitely some form of anti-natalism, but it's not pro-extinction. So again, a bit of a way that it does exist in some form or another. The last thing that I sort of wanted to bring up, that I do find there are certainly a lot of anti-natalists within the anti-natalist community that oppose or are even shocked by the concept of extinction. I think really mainly out of fear. They sort of almost view it as a non sequitur. Like, what if you tell people that to stop having babies, extinction is, is a result of that? What? And I find that reaction a bit shocking, which is fine. But I think that they're mainly opposing it out of not a more rational reason. It's the social situations that will come of that. They don't want the philosophy to be scary. And so I find that more than anything, in speaking to, the past two examples had to do sort of more with how this fits into the past antinatalism. But I think that in modern antinatalism, that's more what I see as far as sort of an anti-extinction sentiment coming from antinatalists today, that it's just something that they just don't want to deal with.
Yeah, so is it mainly a strategic issue, or is it an emotional response to the thought of there just being no more people?
I think it's both.
Okay.
I think it's both. I mean, Mark, do you have any input you'd like to put on that? I mean, you certainly,
So like I'm kind of one of these people, not necessarily out of fear. I think there's a philosophical discussion on the benevolent world explorer thought experiment, because that talks about negative utilitarianism. But at the same time, it's a little bit strategic insofar as, if I'm talking about creating beings into existence, it's a different question about ceasing to exist. So for me, it's about being specific about what I'm arguing. So that would be my only criticism of it. But I think as an overall thing to talk about, it's obviously worth talking about. But when I'm talking about antinatalism, I just want to talk about I want to make the case about creating into existence a being. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So in terms of what's scary, because you just mentioned negative utilitarianism, the anti-natalist view, certainly the one that Benatar advocates for, it's, the mode of going extinct is very passive, right? Whereas with negative utilitarianism, there could be situations in which perhaps you're justified in actively, in embracing this pro-mortalist view, whereby you go out and actively kill people. And so that's scary for the obvious reasons, that it could result in one, for the same reason that murder is scary. But also, obviously, people could be frightened by the prospect of human extinction, just because it's, maybe this gets back to Scheffler's view that, there's a lot of the value, a lot of the things that give our life value seem to be predicated in some deep way on the assumption, or he, I think, would probably say the reality of the indefinite survival, the succession of cohorts leading indefinitely into the future. So I'm just trying to get clear about the matrix of possibility here.
I definitely think that people within the antinatalism community want to advocate for antinatalism, and they do see it as a bit of a roadblock in terms of acceptance of it. So as Amanda said, like, if you're don't create beings into existence, and by the way, this possibly follows from that premise, and then it's like you lose a whole bunch of people. So I think that's probably largely the hesitancy of talking about.
I mean, from my perspective, though, it's like it's a consequence of having this conversation and it manifesting in some way in the real world. So we have a responsibility to have that end of the conversation, even if it is incredibly unpleasant.
Also, I would just add, in terms of strategy, in terms of the extent to which the antinatalist position is appealing. I mean, one of the things I did mention in the article is that Benatar in his book is not shy about saying, that his philosophy is not going to be popular. He's not going to convince a lot of people. But so I mentioned in the paper that, you know, one of the obvious reasons is its apparent implication that we ought to go extinct, and at least for some people, the notion of there being, you know, no more people is equivalent to the notion that, you know, life, or, you know, the various projects they're working on and so on, it end up being meaningless. I mean, Scheffler says, you know, the future of humanity is the future of value. And so by trying to figure out a way to avoid that conclusion that we ought to go extinct, or that extinction is inevitable, then perhaps, you know, the antinatalism could be a bit more appealing than it otherwise would be. But then again, life extension technology is hugely controversial, and a lot of people, you know, have mixed feelings about the development of these technologies and the possible misuses and abuses and so on, which I very much share, and completely bracketed for that paper. Because I find myself more and more critical of a lot of the transhumanist human enhancement type ideas. I find myself really like, I think there are good arguments for why the transhumanist project could be devastating. It could be have catastrophic consequences.
Yes. Not to interrupt you, but I just want to say that I found that very refreshing to hear in your interview with Mark, because I feel like very few people say that. And I just feel like there's so much in transhumanism that is so open to abuse and exploitation and fates worse than death that, and I find it very troubling that that's such an unspoken perspective on it. So I just wanted to say that, but I appreciate you.
I agree that just to pursue this tangent just for a moment, if that's okay.
Of course, absolutely.
Yeah, I've spoken to some colleagues, including one who has taught a class on transhumanism, and we sort of agree that you know, there are critics of transhumanism out there. You know, the obvious names are like Francis Fukuyama and Leon Kass and so on. But the dialogue within the literature that's unfolded between these, you know, the bioconservatives, like the individuals I just named, and then Bostrom and Toby Ord and, you know, some others, we just kind of find it like not very sophisticated. Like there are, I think, some really good arguments to be made for why transhumanism might be really kind of dangerous in various ways, that just haven't really been made in the literature. And so, you know, one of my interests now is to try to think more deeply and more carefully about the various risks associated with you know, radical human enhancement. So yeah, I have very mixed feelings. I'm very ambivalent about life extension technologies. And again, I just bracketed all of that, you know, just a whole book's worth of issues to deal with for the sake of the paper, just to see if, you know, if I could come up with at least some prima facie plausible argument that would relieve my cognitive dissonance.
Hey everyone, I just want to take a quick second out of your regular Exploring Antinatalist podcast episode. I'm Lawrence. I'm one of two hosts. Amanda is the other host of the new Anti-Natal News podcast. This is a new podcast run by Anti-Natalism International. It's a podcast that's going to be monthly, released on the first day of every month. It's going to be covering the big topics both in and out of the anti-natalist community. It's available on the Annie YouTube channel, SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and it will be coming to more platforms soon as well. If you want to let us know about any upcoming news stories relevant to antinatalism, you can email them to us at antinatalnews@gmail.com. And if you want to keep up to date with daily updates for Antinatal News, then head over to Twitter and follow the @Antinatal account. Sorry again for the interruption. I hope you enjoy the rest of the episode.
Okay, so now for some reasons, I think antinatalists cannot oppose human extinctions. I think the reasons are near limitless in my mind, to be honest, but I chose some of the following as rebuttals to what you wrote, as well as some other things. The first one I wanted to bring up, just because I know this is sort of a thing of interest to you, is atheism itself. I was rather delighted when I listened to the interview that you did with Mark to learn that you had, at least in the past, a strong interest in atheism, which I also do as well. I wanted to comment that in my mind, I think the more rationally atheist one becomes, the more one can find reasons to not only be antinatalist, but pro-extinction. If we diagnose the problem of life being the product of unintelligent design, I think it becomes very easy to then diagnose the products of that unintelligent design as broken by design, creatures that should not continue to be manufactured, all better never to have been, and in need of some sort of graceful end. So I'm just curious what you think of that in regards to that perspective.
I mean, it's the premises are right. Yeah, it's the notion that we're intelligently designed is clearly false. We sneeze, we have all sorts of pains, and consequently, the life ends up being saturated to some extent with miseries, and so I what comes to mind is that just because so here's something that comes to mind. So Benatar's version of anti-natalism, there's a point in his book where he claims that the argument that he presents, the harm-benefit asymmetry, is defeasible. So it could be overcome if there are sufficiently strong reasons to actually have a kid. So I think he mentions the case of like a child with who needs a bone marrow transplant, something like that. You need the right donor, and so could apparently be justified having another kid. I think that's the argument the scenario that he mentions. So anyways, point is that, okay, so if the argument that we shouldn't have children because it's immoral can be overcome by certain other considerations, then you might say, okay, even though we live in this atheistic universe and we're the product of just contingent evolution, we're essentially just these mutants that happen to make it through the environmental filter, the filter of our selected environment. There's no, there's no external entity that's imposing, projecting meaning upon our existence. Meaning is just something, value, meaning is something that we just create. But I think there is an argument that we have created meaning and value, things, enterprises, projects, art that is meaningful and valuable, and that it would be a shame if these entities were to disappear, if these projects were to be terminated. And so insofar as one finds that to be compelling, there's a further question of how compelling. Is it compelling enough to overcome the anti-natalist argument? Maybe the reasons for working to create more value and more meaning in the world are powerful enough to justify having children, even for an anti-natalist who says, okay, it's immoral, but there are just these other reasons that warrant an immoral act in this case. So, but I would also say that I despite all the stuff I've said in our discussion so far, I am sympathetic with this notion that the eternal quietude of complete non-existence is maybe not something to be alarmed about. That there is, it is, and I'm also very sympathetic with wild animal suffering, there is a indescribable amount of just suffering that suffuses the natural world, and for that to be expunged, I do think there's a case to be made that would be acceptable, maybe even desirable.
Can I jump in there?
Yeah.
So
Yeah, go ahead.
A discussion with Let's Unite and some others about just human extinction and leaving wildlife to be. Could you explain a little bit more about the case to be made to intervene with wildlife suffering?
Yeah. Also, so I guess Les's view, as I understand it, is on the one hand, you could just what is you can answer the question, what is your problem with procreation? You could say, well, it's that you're bringing an individual into the world who's going to suffer, and as soon as suffering becomes the main issue, then it becomes one might just then make the broader argument that suffering anywhere. It doesn't just have to be just a human being who's suffering. It could be any animal that's suffering. And then you have an argument for why the biosphere should be eliminated. And I guess Les's argument has to do with just the destructiveness of humanity. And that's why we should go. We've just become this kind of alien, this cancer in the Gaian system.
But it's also this responsibility. We have responsibility for things that we affect in terms of the nature and the habitat and other animals, as long as it's something that we're the cause of. But if we're not the cause of that thing, it's just happening in nature. If there are some aspects of suffering, we don't have that responsibility. It's too, what's it called? I feel like Patricia McCormack would say this is messianic, or it's kind of like being a guardian. It's like, who are you to say this is good or bad when it just is? That's just part of nature. And as long as we haven't been the cause of that suffering, our responsibility is not to them. I find this argument possibly problematic, but also I'm sympathetic to some of it, because I think there's a difference between obligations, responsibilities, or voluntary charity towards something that's suffering. I think there's certain levels of responsibility, and I think Peter Singer may have brought this up in his Famine, Affluence, and Morality paper about the drowning child. So when I talked to him, he was like, well, what if there's a drowning deer? Right? Is there two different moral distinctions to be made there? They're both sentient creatures. They're both suffering. Why ignore one and save the other? So I'm just curious about your thoughts on that. And yeah.
And let me just jump in really quick. I'm so sorry, Phil. But again, this just goes back to atheism for me. If we recognize that it's all just a product of this one aberrant molecule, the DNA molecule, then there just can't be all of these different rules essentially for in response to the suffering. We are all the product of that same DNA molecule replicating. So if we suffer, they suffer. We're in need of a graceful end. They are in need of a graceful end. It just seems like it all stems and follows from that. Sorry, that just wanted to make.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And so Les's view, perhaps it's also bound up a bit with a pretty intuitive distinction that moral philosophers have made for the longest time between doing and allowing. There's something worse about doing than there is about allowing. So if you were to go and torture a deer, to use the same example, or to extend that example, if you were to go and torture a deer, that would be very morally unacceptable. But if you were to simply observe from afar, a lion do the same, that's not as bad. And so this ties into the question mark you had a moment ago about interventions, maybe technological interventions into nature in an attempt to reduce the total amount of suffering there. I think a lot of the proponents are consequentialists, like David Pierce obviously comes to mind with his abolitionist project. And he's a utilitarian And so for utilitarians, there's just no distinction between doing and allowing. One is just as bad as the other. So one of the reasons people have suggested that this particular ethical theory is maybe overly demanding. Because any time I could have prevented a harm, I should have. It's just as bad as if I had caused that harm directly. I have sort of mixed feelings about like David Pearce's abolitionist project. On the one hand, I have like a huge amount of intellectual respect for him and moral respect. I think he's a pretty he's a guy to emulate in many ways. But also, I find the proposal a bit kind of sort of messianic, certainly kind of utopian, and quixotic in that sense. Like it's just a bit. It seems if that's. I'm not even sure why we would talk about that right now, because the technology is so far into the future. We understand ecosystems, these highly complex natural systems so poorly. We have such impoverished knowledge of them that it's the practicality of actually intervening to eliminate, intervening into the metabolic pathways or the various predator-prey dynamics in ecosystems. It's just so out there that I don't find that idea very appealing at all, at least not right now. But ultimately, I perhaps there is something to, insofar as the technological means have been developed and the knowledge is sufficiently, robust to actually make interventions in a way that improves, ameliorates the condition of wild creatures, then I think there's probably a moral argument for doing that. I've known some people who, perhaps like Les Unite, who really aren't bothered by wild animal suffering, and I find that very puzzling. It's certainly not my intuitions. Yeah. I'm very disturbed by by how much suffering there is in the world.
Yeah, same.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I think, let me just maybe bounce off of this. I think, this question of sentience and the antinatalist responsibility to sentience, I think this is and will continue to be and expand, as one of the biggest questions and points of interest in the entire topic. Certainly one of the most important points that can be made. I almost sort of like, I almost thought of sort of writing every time I, was reading your paper, I wanted to almost write my own response as, can anti-natalists oppose sentient extinction? Because that's sort of the argument that I always have with people. I will say that in my mind, and I sort of meant to bring this up before, but I do not think it would have been ethical for human beings to go extinct before 1945. Now, that's not to say that it's because I think the right answer is to just blow us all up and take all of sentience with us. But I do think that sentience needs to be freed essentially from the prison of sentience before we go extinct, or that consideration has to be made. As far as human beings go, well, you can do philosophy with human beings. You can attempt to reason with people. You can use antinatalism. Antinatalism is this incredibly peaceful, very easy way to, get our numbers down, go extinct. But for the animals, you just can't use antinatalism with a lion. And maybe there are transhumanistic implement ways. Maybe there are all of these different ways that you could reduce and eliminate animal populations to the point of extinction, and I'd love to be able to find those. But if you couldn't, and if it was found that in order to eliminate sentience from the known universe, you had to sort of get rid of the planet on top of it, that it would not have been ethical to. We would need that technology at our disposal, essentially.
So I wonder if it's not useful to make a distinction between the ecological antinatalism of Vehement and others, and then the philosophical where Benatar really focuses on harms and benefits, pain and pleasure.
Yeah. I should say I'm not a Benatarian. I have huge respect for David Benatar, but he's not what led me to antinatalism, and he's definitely not my preferred version of the philosophy. I'm what's called an Ethicist, which is life spelled backwards. So that originates from YouTube. That originates from somebody named Inmendum. So I just wanted to throw that out there. That based, yeah.
I just want to go on record. Sorry, I just want to go on record. I am a Benatarian. So some people get confused by it because we're both the co-hosts of this. So some people are like, I'm like, yeah, we're different, but we're arguing different positions, and it's part of exploring the philosophy.
So is the claim that it would have been bad if we had gone extinct before 1945? Because we did not have the capability up until roughly then to eliminate all life on the planet.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so it's
insofar as taking care of the animal life. I'm not saying that at 1945, oh, we got the technology, let's just blow it all up. But it would have been, you have to at least have gotten to that point to where we're on the road to dealing with what we can't deal with by ceasing to procreate at the end.
Yeah. So this sounds very similar to Edward von Hartmann's view. I mean, he strongly opposed suicide. He was very pro, maybe that's too strong a way to put it, but he was, for the further development of science and technology. And he was very, optimistic. He wasn't a lugubrious guy. He was optimistic because he thought, we're going to develop more and more technology. Philosophically, we're going to realize that it's the only way, as I mentioned before, to really solve the problem fundamentally is to eliminate all life in the universe. And we'll figure out a way using these advanced tools that we'll develop in the future to, painlessly, for example, eliminate all life. And so, so there's something, maybe interesting about von Hartmann's view, or maybe David Pearce. I don't want to misrepresent his views, but maybe he would agree with this to some extent. There's almost an argument for why human extinction, prior to reaching this state at which we have the technological capabilities sufficient to eliminate all life in the cosmos, why extinction before then would be a tragedy, and why we should work hard to ensure our continued survival. Yeah. Because it would be a shame, because if the one creature, the most intelligent creature, the creature closest to devising a method for solving the problem that antinatalism, as you understand it, is focused on, it'd be a shame if that species disappeared. We need to, so, and I'm not sure if like David Pearce would say, well, extinction would be bad because what we should do is just re-engineer the entire biosphere so there's no suffering, and then the biosphere should continue to exist. And I kind of think that's his view. But also, it seems like you would say, maybe if there's some way we could intervene to painlessly escort out of the theater of existence all species, then that would be a good thing. I didn't mean to interrupt you there. Sorry.
No, not at all. I'm sorry. There's a little bit of a lag and stuff, so I apologize if I interrupted at all. But yes, I just wanted to add that, incidentally, on this very podcast, actually, David Pearce was interviewed by Mark, and he did sort of say that if all else failed, he would press the red button, or he would identify in some way, shape, or form as an ethicist. So I think as a last resort, he would be in agreement with that. But yes, I agree. So yes, I think it would have been an incredible. It would be the most ethical failure, the greatest ethical failure we could possibly commit. Would be to leave the animals alone. Would be to leave the animals to inherit the earth and allow their sentience to remain, in the prison of sentience for a prolonged period of time, to have to undergo natural extinction, which will probably not be a pleasant experience at all. And so that is sort of the greatest responsibility that we have as horrible beings, but also beings that are capable of perhaps devising a method of painless, or at the very least near painless extinction.
Yeah, I think extinction's generally speaking, an unpleasant affair for species. Certainly, if it happens as a result of global catastrophe, as in mass extinction events. So yeah, and that's really interesting about Peirce. I do also get the impression that perhaps as a last resort, some kind of a pro-mortalist alternative would be seriously considered.
Yeah. Okay. Well, excellent. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry. Well, I think we got somewhere good with that. Okay. Well, I just want to talk a little bit about, we touched on it a little bit, this point of mourning and despondency that the topic of extinction sort of ignites in people. I don't take the fact that it's sad, or that we would mourn the world as it dwindled, or that it would make us despondent as reason enough to condemn extinction. Of course, we would feel all those things. I do see and feel the full tragedy of that. I can't even stand that there aren't blockbusters anymore. So I mourn every little bit of this that goes away in front of my eyes. That's the kind of human I am. I'm not at all immune to that sense of mourning. In fact, I've said many times that as an extinctionist, as an antinatalist that favors extinction, you do have to accept a certain amount of constant mourning in one's life. I think that is a hallmark of it. But the question is, at what cost are we not doing something of vital importance for sentient welfare just because it makes us sad, or just because it ignites this sense of mourning in us? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, the last part was, could you ask the last part of the question again real fast?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. But the question is, at what cost are we not doing something of vital importance for the welfare of the sentient creatures on this planet, just because it might make us sad, or it might make us despondent, or it might make us mournful?
Yeah. That's a really good question. I might need to think about that for a second. I mean, it's obviously one would want to think about these issues as rationally as possible, and there's this very strong emotional pull, which may or may not distort a clear vision of what one should do. But I suspect that once, from a kind of like a person affecting view, once everything's gone, I don't feel sad about that's condition, that's the state of non-existence. There's nobody around to bemoan it, but nonetheless, I don't know. There is something. So one could argue, for example, that their species, due to their uniqueness or some other property that they have, that they possess what you could call like final value for itself, for its own sake, and consequently, you could perhaps construe this notion as the universe being impoverished without entities that are finally valuable. And so you might make the argument that the universe itself would just be worse off without different species. There are philosophers like Johann Frick at Princeton who made this argument with respect to human beings. One of the reasons we should not go extinct is we have final value, and consequently, you could say the universe would be more impoverished without us. But yeah, I'm not really sure exactly how to navigate the issue. It's very complicated.
Yeah.
There's a lot of moving parts, and a lot of pieces to fit together. So
absolutely. So I wanted to speak a little bit about life extension, which you write extensively about in the paper. I have to say that everything about it, in my mind, almost seems like another argument for anti-natalism, because it's hard for me to separate out my fears of how that could be exploited, and also just the idea that extra life, I don't think, is a deal breaker for most anti-natalists. most antinatalists do not value the long-term survival of humanity, unless, of course, there's this sentient extinction and when kind of issue. I think it's anathema to most anti-natalists, and I just think that few would see it as a solution to much. Ultimately, life extension solves so little about what we're already condemning life for in the first place. It's a drop in the bucket of suffering. It does nothing to minimize violence. It does nothing to minimize exploitation, avarice, hatred, so many negatives. It would just mean having to endure for a longer span of time. And it would also mean a longer time spent consuming and making victims, essentially, of the other living things around us. So I appreciated what you wrote about it. I thought it was very interesting, but I did not find it convincing that this is an ethical reason to favor non-extinction. What are your thoughts on that? Yeah.
So two things come to mind. One is that Bennett, I know you're not a Bennettarian, but Bennettар, makes this distinction, which I feel like is useful, between a life worth starting and a life worth continuing. And then, he suggests that even though we systematically underestimate how much misery and pain and awfulness there is in our lives due to optimism bias and selective memory and whatever, that nonetheless many of us do have lives that are worth continuing. So obviously life extension provides an opportunity to prolong life. I think a lot of people, even people I've spoken with who are who avow to be opposed to life extension, I find them complaining habitually about, like, I wish there was more time in the day. I really wish I could had the I could study this topic if I had a second life. Only I would really enjoy learning about this topic or whatever. So I think there are reasons for finding that attractive. That and the other thing is if you're an anti-Epicurean, you think that death is a harm for the one who dies. I haven't seen actually much discussion in the philosophical literature on this, but I take it that the default topic, the default phenomenon there that's being discussed is involuntary death. Death, which for most of us it is. And the key thing with life extension is it doesn't mean that you have to live for centuries or for millennia, but it empowers you in the sense that it's up to you how long you stay, how long you remain in the theater of existence. And that, I think, probably when you couch it in that way, I think probably a lot of people would find it quite appealing, because one of the perhaps there are many features of death that are frightening or make people uncomfortable. But certainly one is the involuntariness of it. The fact that at some point someone's going to say, it's time for you to exit the party of life, which will continue without you, and you don't have a choice about the matter. So those are some thoughts on on life extension. I also do. I mean, this touches some issues we were talking about before, but I do think there are all sorts of risks associated with life extension as well, like disparities that are socioeconomic in nature. People at the top getting access, and before people at the bottom, or maybe people at the bottom will never gain access, and that's an issue of justice. And so I do also fear the day that life extension technologies become both safe and effective. I think it could just have radical, it could transform society in all sorts of radical and undesirable ways.
Yeah, you mentioned risk, and I know that's a huge part of what you study. I'm always sort of confused as to why philosophers who make risk, enormous a part of what they study and consider, why antinatalism is not more accepted amongst those that study risk. Because to my mind, if we don't go extinct, and by that I mean on a sentient level, the risk is never going to be over. Like antinatalism does, it does put a stopping point to so much risk. And I just feel like we are already dealing with the existence of the greatest risk already, and that is the cycle of sentience. So if the cycle of sentience is broken, isn't it a fact that we will continue with the greatest risk of all, unless it's interrupted somehow?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. So you're saying, if we continue to exist, then the risk is ongoing and indefinite suffering.
Yeah, that procreation and sentience is a byproduct. Risk is a byproduct of sentience itself. I mean, so long as you create new things, you create new risks.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess just the obvious point is, if you believe that survival matters, people like a lot of people who work within the existential risk community would point to, like a moral imperative to maximize value. Others would point to, the scientific enterprise as constituting a reason for ensuring our continued existence. And so, sure, there's a risk that suffering will continue and maybe even propagate, especially if we spread beyond Earth and terraform other planets and transfer living creatures to exoplanets. But none, that's a risk that's worth taking for the sake of ensuring the continued existence of the Burkean partnership of the generations. And so I guess that's maybe that's too simple of a response.
Well, it just always sort of confuses me, because in my mind it's almost like I liken suffering to a hydra. So we're real good at cutting off some heads of that hydra, but we're not very good at condemning and killing the monster itself, or gracefully ending the monster peacefully. We're not. So I just don't. I'd like to solve the problem as opposed to putting band-aids on it, and I guess that just confuses me with existential risk studies. Yeah.
Again, I would really recommend Hartman's work, because it sounds like there's really significant parallels between the view that you or Etheism maybe and Hartman's a particular philosophical position. I mean, I suppose it also depends on if you what it is that you value, and whether you accept like a plurality of values. For example, like I know for a fact that during the course of the rest of my life there will be all sorts of moments of suffering. Sometimes it'll be intense with medical stuff or personal situations and so on. But there are other things that I value. It's not just the avoidance of suffering, and insofar as it's the case that those other things that I value, my personal projects and positive experiences and so on, insofar as those are sufficiently good, then that's all I need to justify continuing my existence. So I feel like, that's looking at the individual level, and then you obviously can move up to this, the more global level. And so I guess that would be the argument that existential risk scholars would champion. It's just not. It's not just about the reduction of suffering. There's just a multiplicity of other factors that one needs to consider. But that's I think a view that one could reasonably disagree with. You can be like a sort of like negative hedonist. They're obviously like negative utilitarians are focused not on happiness and suffering, but really just on suffering. And so that's definitely a position that someone could take.
Okay, excellent. Thank you for that. Well, I know we're running out of time, but you have a new book coming out, Human Extinction, A History of Thinking About the End of the World. Can you tell us a little something about this book? And just out of curiosity, is antinatalism dealt with in this book at all?
Yeah, so there's a whole chapter on so basically the first first half of the book focuses on our the evolution of thinking about our existential predicament in the universe. The second half focuses on the genealogy of ideas about the moral implications of human extinction. So that history really, the second history, the moral history, begins really in the 1950s. And I would trace it back to a guy named Gunther Anders, who's a kind of obscure German philosopher who was a student of Heidegger's and husband of Hannah Arendt, I think first husband, and it was her first husband, his first wife. Anyway, so he was sort of the first one to systematically really think about what the disappearance of the collective whole would actually mean. But yeah, so the very last chapter there focuses on, like, talks about Benatar, goes into a good amount of detail about like Edward von Hartmann, as well as Zapf, who is the Norwegian, as I'm remembering.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the philosopher who wrote this really fascinating short essay called The Last Messiah, and so various others. So I definitely talk about the potential pros of human extinction, not just all the cons that have been the main focus from Gunther Anders through Jonathan Schell, through Derek Parfit, and then existential risk scholars.
Okay.
And then really the first part of the book is looking at the discovery of kill mechanisms, which by definition are means of extermination that are either anthropogenic or natural in nature. And so I hinted at the beginning of our conversation that there had been these idiosyncratic speculations about how natural phenomena, comets, for example, that could sweep past Earth and remove nitrogen, for example, from the atmosphere, and leaving just oxygen, which is highly combustible. So as a result, then the Earth, there's this massive worldwide conflagration. Edgar Allan Poe has a short story about that. And then Jules Verne with this massive boiler explosion. But it really wasn't until the 1850s that, with when the second law was formalized for the first time, that you have this scientifically credible kill mechanism. And then it really wasn't until the 1950s when you have the second one, and then a lot of people are very surprised to discover it wasn't until the 1980s that we believed that asteroids could actually slam into Earth and cause mass extinctions. That was basically almost no scientists since the early 1800s up until the 1980s, 1990s believed in that. And then kind of the most recent transition in our thinking about the existential predicament of humanity was around the 2000s, when there was suddenly this very anxious focus on dual-use emerging technologies. So the book sort of traces it offers this kind of periodization of history in terms of thinking about our situation, whether it's possible for us to go extinct, if so, how probable it is. And then the second half looks at sort of our thinking about the morality and the value theoretic aspects of human extinction.
It sounds phenomenal. When is there a projected release date yet?
I don't have a release date yet.
That's all right.
But it's written, and I've sent it out to a bunch of people for comments. It's sort of in that stage right now. But I'm really excited about it. I mean, very few people have written about this issue, so that it was just really a pleasure, sort of like mapping out this terrain. Which so.
Well, congratulations! Yeah, congratulations. I really look forward to reading it. Absolutely.
Thanks.
Mark, do you have anything?
I'd just like to quickly touch on your mini book on your website, The Case Against Long-Termism. Could you give a rough, it sounds like a quick critique on, I haven't read it yet, but against consequentialism essentially, but I could be wrong on that. Could you just give like a summary of that? And
Sure. Yeah. It's, I mean, it really is a mini book. It's about 11,000 words. And it basically distills, hopefully in an intelligible manner, my thinking about the version of long-termism that comes out of Bostrom's work in particular. And so a lot of it has to do with total utilitarianism, which Bostrom, I'm not sure he ever explicitly endorses, but it's certainly, it just, it pervades his writings on these topics, as well as the transhumanist aspect. So, Bostromism, as I call it, really can be dissected into a utilitarian component and then a transhumanist component. And essentially the argument, which is supported by a fair amount of excerpts from Bostrom's writings, is that it's the combination of this techno-utopian vision of the future, in which the amount of value is astronomical in quantity, combined with the utilitarian mode of moral reasoning, that I think is a really dangerous combination. There are plenty of historical examples, where there's the promise of utopia. Marxism, Leninism. Marx said very little about what the communist state would actually be, but there was this kind of view that it's going to be this utopian state. I mean, it's the total eradication of alienation and class distinctions and so on. And then Leninism, Vladimir Lenin came along and kind of introduced this utilitarian view that we need to catalyze the realization of this telos, this final state. No matter what, the ends will justify the means. That's just one example. I mean, there are many, many more, so I quote some Swedish statistician who wrote a book on existential risk, Ole Hagström, who I think is kind of sympathetic in the end with long-termism, but he essentially has this. He sketches out this vignette in his book where he imagines a politician who understands expected value theory and accepts the general Bostromian framework for thinking about the future, and worries that this politician will be able to do the arithmetic, crunch the numbers, and then conclude that if there's a 1 in a million chance that somebody, this is from the example itself, somebody within the borders of Germany could successfully trigger an existential catastrophe, that that a government state would be justified morally in obliterating Germany. So even with really tiny numbers, given the fact that there is so much potential value awaiting us in the future, this would be value realized through colonizing space, converting celestial bodies like exoplanets into computronium, and then simulating huge numbers, massive numbers of conscious beings who have net positive lives. Then even if there's a tiny percentage that that this future would be prevented from coming into existence, that could justify all sorts of atrocities, all sorts of extreme actions. And again, there's a good parallel with religion. There are terrorists out there who are engaged in all sorts of catastrophic actions for the greater cosmic good, for the sake of attaining utopia. So it's these ingredients that worry me a lot. And I think when you look at some of the stuff that Bostrom has actually written, it's kind of horrifying. Some of his statements are pretty frightening, at least in my opinion. Yeah. So that's the gist of the mini book. I definitely would encourage people to take a look, because I think it's important that people know the term long-termism itself sounds very benign and very welcoming, but it's much the philosophy behind it entails so much more than just a pivot towards peering at the temporal horizon, rather than just focusing on myopically focusing on just near-term issues.
Yeah, and thanks for having that available on your website, and also having the previous paper we talked about on your website. So for viewers and listeners, please check that out.
Yeah, no paywall.
Yeah, that's very, very generous of you. Thank you for that. Okay, well, Phil, it's been an absolute pleasure getting to speak with you today. And thank you so much for being our guest on Exploring Antinatalism. Congratulations again on the new book. We're very looking forward to checking it out. And yeah, it's been a pleasure getting a chance to meet you.
Absolutely. This was really wonderful. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Please visit Phil Torres' website, X-Riskology, where you can find a copy of his paper, Can Anti-Natalists Oppose Human Extinction, for free. Follow Phil Torres on Twitter and help support his work on Patreon. All these and several other interesting Phil Torres links below. Hello everyone, it's Amanda. As many of you know, Anti-Natalism International is so proud to host the inaugural year of the Anti-Natalist Film Festival, a historic, first-of-its-kind event featuring the cinematic talents of the anti-natalist community and anyone else who wishes to participate. This is officially the first big initiative of Anti-Natalism International, and is honestly something that I've wanted to see happen for years now. The festival itself will be held the entire month of October 2021, and for this first year of the festival will be entirely an online screening event on the Anti-Natalism International website. In future years, however, we hope to be able to expand this event in several ways, not least of which is to make it a full, live, in-person event. So, are you thinking of submitting a video or film to the festival? Remember that the first early bird deadline to submit your film or video to the film festival on Film Freeway is March 31st. Please visit our links below to see the Film Freeway page with more info. Submission to the film festival is free. So thank you for listening, everyone. Can't wait to see what you all submit to the festival. Thank you so much, all the best, and bye for now. Thank you for listening to the Exploring Antinatalism Podcast. This has been Amanda Oldfan-Sukenick and Mark J. Maharaj. You can find us on the YouTube channels Forever Wolf Films and Question Mark, respectively. Keep up with my daily anti-natalist news updates at Antinatal News on Twitter. Please follow the podcast on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and email us at exploringantinatalism@gmail.com. The podcast can be listened to on the YouTube channel Exploring Antinatalism Podcast, as well as Buzzsprout, Apple Podcasts, and Stitcher. Our website, www.exploringantinatalism.com, was designed by the amazing Visions Noir. Please visit Visions Noir at www.bionoir.com and find more links to more of his work below. Logo art by the incredible LifeSucks. Please visit his YouTube channel, and if you would perhaps like to purchase one of the new Exploring Antinatalism t-shirts by LifeSucks, please visit his Etsy page, www.etsy.com/shop/LifeSucksPublishing. And proudly announcing, our new theme music has been graciously provided by I Doubt It. I Doubt It is an alum of the Exploring Antinatalism podcast, so listen to his episode 4, and visit his amazing YouTube channel. All the best, and bye for now.